The Bardo Thodol, a fundamental text of Tibetan Buddhism, represents liberation through hearing, whispered into the ear or read aloud to a dying or dead person. Composed in the latter part of the 8th century of the Common Era by the great Indian Buddhist master Padmasambhava, Guru Rinpoche, who brought Tantric Buddhism to Tibet, and dictated by him to his Tibetan consort, the yogini Yeshit Tsogyal, the Bardo Thodol, Liberation Through Understanding in the Between, known in English as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is on the surface a guidebook to the state of the in-between death and rebirth. But it's really much more than that. It could be characterized as an in-depth exploration of the Vajrayana Buddhist attitude toward death and rebirth, and what one might do to prepare for the inevitability of death in a positive way, or in more contemporary language, how to prepare for a good death. His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama has written, "Generally speaking, the practices of highest Yoga Tantra, of which the Bardo Thodol is part, present a spiritual path which enables the individual to attain complete Buddhahood within a single lifetime, prior to the moment of death. Yet, for those of us who are unable to achieve this, it becomes crucial to use the transformative opportunities offered by the natural occurring processes of death, the intermediate state, and rebirth. Hence, in highest Yoga Tantra, it is not merely the preparation for a more developed future rebirth which is important, but of more fundamental significance is the personal preparation for using one's own death and subsequent states as a means for achieving liberation." The renowned Buddhist scholar Robert Thurman, professor of Indo-Tibetan Studies at Columbia University, who Time magazine has called a larger-than-life scholar activist destined to convey the Dharma, the precious teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, from Asia to America, and who the New York Times called the leading American expert on Tibetan Buddhism, describes Padmasambhava as semi-legendary, with a biography that contains some of the exploits also attributed to the Buddha himself and others in the early history of the religion. Padmasambhava is supposed to have said, "My mother is wisdom, my father compassion, my country the Dharma of reality." In addition to composing the Bardo Thodol, Padmasambhava was the founder of the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism in the 8th century of the Common Era, the oldest school of Tibetan Buddhism. Nyingma masters were renowned for hiding spiritual treasures in physical and non-physical form that would later be discovered when the world was ripe for what the treasures had to offer, the teachings they contained. These hidden treasures are called termas. The Bardo Thodol is such a terma, having been discovered by the treasure seeker Karmalingpa in the 14th century of the Common Era in a cave in Tibet. According to legend, Padmasambhava has lived for many centuries, and even today he lives somewhere in Africa or Arabia, on the Copper Glory Mountain, or perhaps in another dimension. The first English translation of the Bardo Thodol was produced by Walter Evans Wentz, who was born in 1878 in New Jersey. He graduated in philosophy from Stanford University in California, and beginning in 1917, spent 5 years in India and Sikkim, where he became a Tibetan Buddhist monk. In Sikkim, Evans Wentz met Lama Kazi Dawa Samdup, who was translating the Bardo Thodol from Tibetan into English. The Lama took in Evans Wentz as his student. Spending more than 5 years on the translation, it was Evans Wentz who gave the book its inappropriate English title, The Tibetan Book of the Dead, probably inspired to some extent by the title of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which was enjoying a fair degree of popularity in the esoteric and spiritualist communities of the 1920s. Oxford University published the Tibetan Book of the Dead in 1928. The Tibetan word bardo literally means in between. The text of the Bardo Thodol has instructions both for the deceased on how to proceed through the bardo and for the reader about when and how to read the text to the dying or dead person. It is usually left to an experienced lama to guide the deceased through the in-between. The preliminary prayers of the Bardo Thodol are used to orient the dying person to the death process and instill a proper frame of mind to assure either a good rebirth or liberation. There is some discussion about which Tibetan text of the Bardo Thodol most closely follows the original. Probably the most accurate version of the Bardo Thodol is a manuscript from the library of the late Nyingma master Dujum Rinpoche. Jerme Dorje's 2005 English translation of the Bardo Thodol is based on this version. One of the greatest challenges in being human is dealing with the grief and anguish resulting from the death of a loved one. The purpose of ritual is to create a connection between the concrete and the symbolic as a way to mitigate that grief, and in the case of the Bardo Thodol, to create a connection between the living and the dead. The rituals of the Bardo Thodol involve the progression of the subtle consciousness of the deceased person from this life to the next, and following the rituals provides the loved ones of the deceased a measure of comfort. Knowing that death is fraught with danger and opportunity, they are doing all that they can to assure a good rebirth, or perhaps even liberation, for the one now in the in-between. The Bardo Thodol describes the journey of the consciousness through the state of the in-between. The subtle mental consciousness will meet terrifying apparitions. The Bardo Thodol is quite clear, though. In the state between death and rebirth, all apparitions that are seen by the subtle consciousness are mental constructs, and there is no need to fear them or death, because one is already dead, so that the consciousness can rest in its own nature, maintaining a mental clarity and calmness that will allow it to comprehend what is happening. One author has written that the text teaches people how to die. It gives people an exemplary model of death. It gives image and shape to it. The famous Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung was what could only be described as an enthusiast of the Bardo Thodol. In his psychological commentary to the 1960 edition of the Bardo Thodol, translated by Evans Wentz, he writes, "I am sure that all who read this book with open eyes, and who allow it to impress itself upon them without prejudice, will reap rich reward, and the Bardo Thodol offers one an intelligent philosophy addressed to human beings. Its philosophy contains the quintessence of Buddhist psychological criticism, and as such, one can say that it is of an unexampled superiority." That the Bardo Thodol is viewed as a journey, psychic or real, depending on your religious belief, is beyond question. Jung speaks to this quality when he refers to it as a guidebook through the in-between. Today, in the West, most of us have finally come to realize that the socio-cultural imperialism we have practiced for the last 600 years is a grave mistake, and that we have a great deal to learn from the cultures of Asia and Africa, from the cultures of the indigenous peoples of the United States and Canada, Latin America, and the Pacific. Through a combination of study and practice, approaching with open minds and open hearts, what were once thought to be esoteric and naive texts and rituals of non-European cultures, we can learn the benefits that these gifts hold for all humanity. For those of us who have chosen to embark on vocations of service to those in need of spiritual comfort and guidance, we can employ the lessons and rituals of the great spiritual and practical works like the Bardo Thodol to bring peace, serenity, and possibly liberation to those willing to listen.